All right, everyone. So this is going to be our first lecture that y'all have had in a good while, and it's going to be a longer one. So go ahead, get everything set and ready. Try to get this knocked out in one sitting, or if you need to break it up a little bit, make sure to remember on YouTube, you can go and turn on the captions, the closed captioning option when you're watching this video, and that'll help to make sure that you it can make listening to this a little bit faster if you have all the words at the bottom. It may help. Also, make sure to like and subscribe to this channel so that you get notifications when I post new videos as well. That'll help you keep updated. So, on Google Classroom, you should see, obviously, you've opened up the tab to bring up this lecture notes. So this is covering everything from the Washington administration, so George Washington, our first president, to Andrew Jackson, who is going to be our 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, eighth president. So we're covering a lot of information at once. This is probably going to be our longest lecture of the year. So here we go. So where we left off, we were having that big debate between the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist. So the Federalists wanted that strong central government. They wanted a strong central government because they saw after Shays' rebellion that they were worried about the common people rising up. So the elites were worried. Anti-Federalists were led by George Washington, or not George Washington, excuse me, led by Thomas Jefferson, whereas the Federalists were led by Jefferson, Hamilton, and all the people that wanted a strong government. So this first section on our notes, we start to see these political divisions start to emerge, and we look at Hamilton's Bank of the United States program. So Alexander Hamilton, he wanted to establish a financial stability. He wanted the nation to be strong financially. So to do that, he wanted to make a Bank of the United States, so a central bank for the United States. And so he called on the federal government to take on the state's debts to help boost the economy. So he wanted the federal government to say, okay, all the states had their own debts from the revolution, from just getting debt to begin with. So he said, all right, the federal government will take all of it, and in return, it'll help boost the economy. This wasn't very popular. Well, it was popular among the Federalists, but there was the Republicans that were against it. So we start to see this emergence of opposition, these three causes of political parties. So Hamilton, he wanted to align the U.S. to England, who, if we remember, England, we just fought to break away from them. While Thomas Jefferson, he wanted to expand the U.S. out west. So Jefferson, he wasn't really for becoming allies with England. He was like, we just broke away from them. We should be with France. So like I just said, Jefferson wanted the U.S. to help France during the French Revolution. But Alexander Hamilton, he convinced Washington to stay neutral. So those are your first two causes of the political party. So the first one was Hamilton wanted to align with England, whereas Jefferson wanted to expand the U.S. out west. So the second reason, Jefferson wanted the U.S. to help France during the French Revolution, but because the United States was allies with France from back during the American Revolution. But Hamilton convinced Washington to stay neutral and not help out France. And so the final straw was when John Jay, John Jay, he made a secret treaty with England which ended any hopes of a peace or a treaty with France. And so this directly led to the creation of political parties. So that was kind of like the final straw, was when John Jay, who eventually became the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, he made this secret treaty with England, which essentially cut out France. And this was like the final straw for Thomas Jefferson. So he created what was known as the Republicans. And I promise you, this is not the Republicans that we know of today. Still kind of just as, yeah, we'll just leave it at that. They're not the Republicans of today. So looking at this next section, the Federalist versus the Republicans. Once again, I emphasize this is not the Republicans of today. So, the Federalists, they were supporters of Washington. They favored Alexander Hamilton's plan, so they wanted a stronger central government, and they wanted to be close allies with England or Britain. So they were made up of the elites, lawyers, and politicians. So made up of the elites. They were kind of the elitist group, the Federalist. The Republicans, they wanted to be allies with France, and they wanted to have more control of the government. And they wanted to have more control of the government and the people to, for the people to have more of a say-so in how the government was elected than the elites. So Hamilton, who was part of the Federalist, he was more so, hey, the elites are this set group that need to be in control of the government. The Republicans, on the other hand, wanted more of a say-so from the people. They wanted the people to have a say-so in who was elected to the government. Also, the Federalist, as you see in this picture right here, the Federalists, they had a loose interpretation of the Constitution. So they believed that, the government can have a stronger role in people's lives, as we see today. And the Democratic Republicans, as they're also known, it says Constitution is Constitution. So literally they believe that whatever was in the Constitution, that is all that the government should do. Or that's what they claim, but we will see that that is not necessarily the case coming up. Okay, so we get to John Adams. He is the second president, and his entire presidency is going to be one huge failure. We see the Alien and Sedition Act is going to be the big thing that's going to be talked about for him. So after 2 terms, Washington decided not to run again. So Washington could have kept going and be president for life, but he said, nope, I want to just be there 2 times, and I'm sick of this. So John Adams ran against Thomas Jefferson, and Adams actually beat out Thomas Jefferson. So because Jefferson came in second place, he became the vice president. So Adams' presidency was just one crisis after another, and it was just an overall failure. He was the first one-term president, Donald Trump. Anyway, so the Alien and Sedition Act, as mentioned at the top of your notes for this section, the Alien and Sedition Act. So the government silenced any voice who opposed what they said, claiming that it was in the interest of national security. Kind of sounds similar to right now. So the government, if anybody spoke out against them, then the government could silence them, saying that it was a threat against the government. This also allowed the government to deport anyone that they viewed as dangerous to the country. So literally, if you disagreed with the president, then you could be deported, even if you were a citizen. Also, while we're at this, I want to make sure you notice on the left side of your notes page, there is a long timeline of events. These are major events of the American history. So from literally where we're starting in this unit, there's so many different terms that we're not going to have time to go over because we are already in February. So I created this major events and presidents timeline. So everything that we're covering, I have a major on the list. So it goes from 1789 to literally 1841. So we got plenty of events being covered, but you see that is on the timeline. That is fair game for a future test, just FYI. So we get to Thomas Jefferson and Jefferson's presidency. It's known as the Revolution of 1800. Revolution. So anyway, Thomas Jefferson, remember, he was a anti-federalist and that became a Democratic Republican. So he claimed that he wanted small government. Small government, only what's in the Constitution is what the government should do. So we see that Jefferson ran against this guy named Aaron Burr, who is a jerk. We'll talk about Aaron Burr in a second. If you know anything about Hamilton, then you know Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr. So he became the third president. He also became the first president to live in the White House. So Jefferson claimed to be for a small government, like I mentioned, but soon he proved that that really wasn't the case. So the first big Supreme Court decision that you need to know is Marbury versus Madison. So Marbury v. Madison. So these are major Supreme Court case decisions that really shaped our nation's future. So Marbury versus Madison. So this was a Supreme Court decision that decided the Supreme Court could actually review laws that Congress and the states passed to decide whether they were legal or not. So pretty much it's the Supreme Court saying, all right, we get to decide whether states pass laws, whether they're legal or not, whether they're good enough or not. So this was probably one of the most important decisions ever made by the Supreme Court, since this helped ensure that the Supreme Court could make changes when needed to the Constitution. So pretty much it's saying, hey, the states can't just pass anything, or the government can't just pass anything. It has to be according to the Constitution. And so we mentioned that Thomas Jefferson was all for the strict interpretation of the Constitution. He wanted a small government, or so he claims. But there are three big examples that we're going to cover that completely lie about that. The first example is the Louisiana Purchase that happened in 1803. So this is what it bought the Louisiana territory from France for $15 million, which that doubled the size of the United States. So the states were literally right around 14 or 15 states at this point, and it doubled the size of the country. So that's a game changer for this nation. So let's see. So the ability for the president to purchase territories was not listed in the Constitution, so Thomas Jefferson should have not been for this. But he was. And this is just yet another example of Native Americans not being even considered, and only served to allow the spread of slavery out west. But they claim it was for farmers, except, what were they using as labor for farming? Once again, Thomas Jefferson, he was all men are created equal. He wrote the Declaration of Independence, but yet he also owned 267 slaves and wanted to help expand slavery. So, we see that this was his first big, movement towards a larger government. The second example was this thing called the Barbary War, Barbary, the Barbary War. So this was one of the first wars that the United States got into. And so, once again, Jefferson wanted to limit the size of government, but yet used his power as the president to protect American foreign trade. So the Barbary states, they were islands off the coast of Africa, and these pirates would capture American ships and hold them for ransom. And so the U.S. declared war on these islands and won. But what is really important to know from this is the long-term effect from this war. This was the very first encounter that the U.S. had with the religion of Islam. So this was off the coast of Africa, so the religion of Islam was a major religion over there. So this was the first real big encounter that anybody in the U.S. had with this religion. So up until this war, the U.S. had declared that it was not in any way, and I quote, founded on the Christian religion. And they did this in order to seem welcoming to other religions. But as this war continued, the U.S. people began to distrust the religion of Islam, and it would only grow into the hatred and mistrust that we see today towards the Islamic religion. So all these issues that we have in this country that people are terrified about Muslims, this started thanks to the Barbary War. And so the third example of Thomas Jefferson expanding the powers of the government way past what he claimed to want to do, because he was all for small government, except when he actually needed to get something done, was the Embargo Act. EMBARGO, the Embargo Act. So Essentially, what this was Jefferson placed a ban on trading with all other foreign nations. So pretty much he cut off the world from trade, which if you need to make money, that means you need to trade with other people. So how are you going to make money if you don't trade? But this was also a huge jump in federal powers because the federal government was banning every single state from trading with other countries. Not really helpful when you're wanting to expand your country. So we get to Aaron Burr. So Alexander Hamilton was murdered by Aaron Burr in 1803, same year as the Louisiana Purchase. So what you need to know is that when Thomas Jefferson was running for president against Aaron Burr, Alexander Hamilton could have supported Aaron Burr because Hamilton and Burr were friends. They grew up knowing each other. But Aaron Burr was obsessed with power and he was a horrible politician, just to be honest. He made no sense whatsoever in any of his policies that he wanted. And so Alexander Hamilton decided to support Thomas Jefferson, who Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Jefferson were rivals. They didn't really get along, but Hamilton decided to support Thomas Jefferson. So Aaron Burr lost the election to Thomas Jefferson, and Aaron Burr decided to challenge Alexander Hamilton to a duel, which means they each had a pistol. They lined up about 10 feet away from each other and turned around and shot at each other to try and kill each other. This used to be legal in this country. So Burr shot and killed Alexander Hamilton, who was the first who created the whole banking system in this country. And so Burr went on to try and form a new nation and get a part of that land was part of what is today Texas. So he tried to break away from the United States, and just like everything else in his life, he failed and died a miserable failure of a person. Alexander Hamilton was murdered by Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr went on to be nothing. Anywho, moving on to people that are actually relevant. We're going to talk about James Madison in the War of 1812, aka the Second War for Independence. This is what? 30 years after the American Revolution, we're having a second war against England. So we see that James Madison came into office after Thomas Jefferson, and the U.S. was on the brink of war with England already when he came into office in 1812. So a group of younger congressmen had started to take over, and they were known as the War Hawks because they were pushing for war because of a great sense of national pride. So they thought, we're Americans. This is the first view of it. We're Americans. We can beat anybody. Except, after seeing the British push the Native Americans to attack U.S. settlers and the British Navy attacking U.S. ships, Hamilton decided to declare war. But not all of the U.S. was for going to war. It was actually one of the slimmest margins to ever pass Congress. There was only a difference of 3 votes. 3 votes that could have kept us from going to war again. And a lot of us kind of wish that it would have, because this was an absolute disaster of a war. Absolute disaster. The U.S. was financially and militarily not ready for war. And so the British were able to fight off a U.S. invasion into Canada, of all places. What has Canada ever done to us? But yet we tried to invade Canada. And they were able to actually take over, the British were actually able to take over Washington, D.C. and burn down the White House. So the White House you see today is not the original White House. It was burned down in 1814 by the British. But the Treaty of Ghent, Ghent, that ended the war. So after years of fighting, both sides had grown tired of fighting back and forth. There was no end in sight, and it was too expensive. So the Treaty of Ghent ended the fighting. There was no major changes that happened, but it became known as the Second War of Independence. The main thing that you need to know is that Andrew Jackson who is a general in this war, became a national hero due to killing people and wiping out Native Americans in Florida, even though he was ordered not to, and the Battle of New Orleans, which took place after the war was already over. Go, Andrew Jackson. So, we now have the United States set up. We claim to have won the War of 1812, even though we didn't. We're our own nation. We proved that we could hang, that we wouldn't, just be pushed around. So we start off this thing known as westward expansion and manifest destiny. So between the 1820s and the 1850s, millions of Americans began to expand westward. We began to move westward. There was just these things called Native Americans living there, but whatever. My land now, as the meme says. So they began to move westward, searching for land, gold, and wanting to expand slavery. So this guy named John O'Sullivan, he coined the term manifest destiny because he said that it was to state that God had said the Americans deserved to spread out as far as they could and take the land. So he said, God gave us this land and it is ours to take. It is ours for the taking. Like I said, just forget about the fact that there are millions of Native Americans who were there first. But this was just the way to justify the U.S. taking this land from the Native Americans. All right. So we have the American system. So following the War of 1812, citizens realized that the U.S. had to grow to become a national power, a world power, excuse me. So because we barely didn't even win this war of 1812, we realized that we had to expand to become a world power. So they needed to focus on moving away from just being a farming society to an industrial society. We needed to have factories. We needed to make our own goods. We needed to build things, not just farm. So one of the senators named Henry Clay, he created this three-part plan to move the U.S. forward. So he had three parts of his American system. One was creating a new national bank. Second, he wanted to place a tax on goods that were imported, so brought in to protect U.S. businesses. So he said, if we're going to bring in goods from other countries, we're going to put a tax on them because we would rather people buy from America. And they wanted to fund roads and canals, which is how ships are able to move from one river to another or from one ocean to a river or stuff like that, a canal throughout the country. So they wanted to fund roads and canals throughout the country. That is the American system. Moving on, we have this thing called the Missouri Compromise. So this was the start of the westward expansion of slavery. So the issue of expansion of slavery would always be a major issue for this country. And each time, it was due to each time a new state was added to the U.S. So they had to decide whether they wanted that state to be a free state or a slave state. So in 1820, the Missouri Territory wanted to become a new slave state. So they wanted to become a new state and they wanted to be a slave state. So this compromise decided that Missouri would become a slave state, excuse me. So let me start over. Missouri would become a slave state. Maine would come in as a free state because up until that time, the state of Maine was part of Massachusetts. And that slavery would be illegal in any new state that was added out west. So this was the big three-part Missouri Compromise. And so this officially started the expansion of slavery out west. So this is what officially started this expansion of slavery out west. So that's the Missouri Compromise. Now we move on to the Monroe Doctrine. James Monroe is president now. James Monroe. And so, yeah, this is a ton of information and we're covering a huge bit of time. But I want to be able to kind of breeze through this information so that we can move on towards these Civil War and Reconstruction. So, this Monroe Doctrine. The U.S. feared that European countries would start to take economic control of Latin and South America. So, during this time period, around the early 1820s, many states, Latin American states and South American countries, had started to break away from Spain and break away from Portugal to form their own countries. And so the Americans realized that Europeans would still try to have their control over this area. So the Monroe Doctrine declared three things. They said that the U.S., number one, would oppose any European efforts to colonize Latin and South America. So the U.S. said that they would not allow anything like that to happen. The second part of the Monroe Doctrine said that the U.S. would keep out of any European wars. The U.S. would not join any European wars. And the third is that President Monroe warned the European powers to stay out of essentially the Western Hemisphere. So he warned European powers to not interfere with any new independent Latin American country. And why? Why does the U.S. Does the U.S. really care about Latin American countries being free? No. The U.S. wanted to be their trade partner. So the U.S. saw this as a way to gain new ways to trade. Okay. So we see that this document pretty much made the U.S. the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere. This made the U.S. the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere. Okay. So that's James Monroe. So he's going to be president from 1820 to 1824. John Quincy Adams is going to be president from 1824 to 1828. He's not going to really do much. He is the son of John Adams. So that's the first father-son presidency that we see. Then we get to the 1828 election with this wonderful character named Andrew Jackson. Good Lord. This is where we're going to start doing our next activity on Andrew Jackson, who is a real character, we'll say. He is a wonderful human being. This is dripping in sarcasm. So, the 1828 election. So the election of Andrew Jackson in 1828, he ran against John Quincy Adams and won. This made it clear that something had changed in U.S. politics. Note how many parallels there are between Andrew Jackson and Donald J. Trump. Okay? Just notice that as we go through this unit. So everyone saw Jackson's election as one that was made by the people, since the election process that we know of today started during this time. So the people actually voting to send presidential electors from our state through the Electoral College in to vote for the president that we see today started in this 1828 election. So this was seen as an expansion of democracy. So there were four huge themes that you need to know about Andrew Jackson during this age of Jackson, the Jacksonian America. One is that it was the expansion of the U.S. as an industrial nation. So we started adding more big-time textile manufacturing businesses. The second was the movement west. The third, which goes along with the second, is the expansion of slavery. So slavery jumped out west. Between the 1820s and the 1850s, we saw slavery skyrocket in the western United States. But wait, slavery was supposed to not move out west thanks to the Missouri Compromise. It's almost like people just ignored it. Isn't that something? So, and the last of the four main themes is the expansion of quote, quote, democracy. So the ability of people to have their voices heard. So in 1828, Andrew Jackson was elected on a platform. So his main things that he was running on was nationalism, strong states' rights, and the removal of Native Americans. So he was a strong believer in strong nationalism, strong states' rights, and the removal of Native Americans. He also had this new thing called the spoils system. The spoils system. Who's ever heard of to the victor goes the spoils? So those who supported him in the election essentially would be rewarded with positions in his administration. Similar to Donald Trump. So you could, I don't know, be like Betsy DeVos and never set foot as a teacher and be the Secretary of Education. Crazy, because she also donated millions of dollars to Donald Trump's election. Crazy. But the spoils system, you pretty much, if you supported the president, who would be Andrew Jackson running for president, he would reward you with a cabinet position or a position in government. Okay, so we have Andrew Jackson as president right now. Then we get to the Tariff of Abominations and this wonderful looking human being named John C. Calhoun with the South Carolina and the nullification crisis. So the Tariff of Abominations, as we remember, a tariff is also known as a tax. And so the tariff raised taxes on imported goods that was really unpopular in the South. So imported goods being brought into the country. So it was really unpopular in the South because they had to import more industry goods than the North, since the South was mainly farming still. So states in the South, like South Carolina, were having to pay a higher tax to import goods. But they were also very wealthy at the same time because they had slaves. So South Carolina leaders threatened to nullify or reject this tariff in their state. So South Carolina didn't agree with the Tariff of Abomination, so they're just going to say, what tax? We don't see it. We're not paying it. So they threatened to nullify this tax. And so the whole desire to do this was the fear that if they didn't stop the power of the federal government, that one day the federal government could end slavery. God forbid. So they believed that if the government could set up this huge tax on them, then one day they could end slavery as well. So they had to make a stand. So John C. Calhoun, this guy with the crazy hair that you see on the left, he was once the vice president, but now he's a representative in South Carolina. He was the leader of this nullification movement, is what it was called, the nullification movement. So he claimed that the national government had been created by an agreement among the individual states. So when they moved from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution, he claimed that it was because it was an agreement among individual states. And so because of that, the states had the right to reject laws that they didn't agree with. So because the states were each independent-minded, they could reject a law that they didn't like. And this belief eventually was the same argument used by the states to secede or leave the United States during the Civil War. So John C. Calhoun is the man who helped start the movement to break away from the United States. So as if it's not good enough already in the United States during this time, we have Native American removal. We have removal of Native Americans from their homelands. So we see this is known as the Trail of Tears and Worcester v. Georgia. So the desire of slave owners to continue pushing west to plant more cotton brought the issue of Native Americans to a head finally. These settlers continued wanting to move west, so into Alabama, into Georgia, into Mississippi, into Tennessee, Arkansas, Missouri, and further west into Texas. All of these places, all of these white settlers were moving in and they're going, we need this land, but there's Native Americans in the way. What can we do? Oh, let's move them, because that totally makes sense. It's not like that was their land or anything. So they started to push Native Americans further and further west. So we see Jackson's Indian Removal Act provided funds, so provided money to remove the so-called 5 civilized tribes from the South and force them to march west to Oklahoma. So for so long, Native Americans had been told to, quote, civilize and join American society. But now that wasn't good enough anymore. Even the Native Americans that had joined this American society, like they had assimilated is what it's called, like the Cherokee, they had assimilated to try and join what they called white society. But that wasn't good enough anymore. And so it was decided that they must be relocated out west. So this Supreme Court decision, known as Worcester v. Georgia, this is where the Supreme Court decided they actually sided with the Native Americans. And they said that they had a right to their land because the treaties that had been made between the Native Americans and the United States during the American Revolution. So they said, hey, y'all can't move the Native Americans. It is their land. That is theirs. So Jackson, he said, well, I'm just going to ignore the Supreme Court ruling. And he declared, and I quote, let the Supreme Court try to enforce it. So let them try to enforce their own decision. Andrew Jackson said, your move, essentially. So he said, make me, essentially. So the Supreme Court just threw up their hands and said, well, we tried, so sorry. And so this is what became known as the Trail of Tears. So over the next 7 years, over 18,000 men, women, and children were forced to walk over 2,000 miles from like Georgia, Florida, Alabama to Oklahoma. They were forced to walk over 2,000 miles in the winter with nothing. They were forced to walk. So 18,000 people left. 6,000 died during that movement, that long 2,000-mile walk. America. So, last little section we're going to talk about on these notes is the Seminoles. The Seminoles. So you probably know them as Florida State Seminoles. So they were a Native American tribe, Seminole, because I know somebody's going to be like, how can I spell that even though I have the internet right in front of me? How do I spell it? Well, Seminole. The Seminoles in Florida refused to leave Florida because it was their land, and they fought back. They were assisted by slaves who had escaped into Florida. So we see, here's a big threat to power. We see the Native Americans and these escaped slaves fighting together. And this had to be put down because that was a threat to power. So they were eventually killed or surrendered. So this is where the Seminoles gained their fame. There's actually still a tribe of Seminoles in southeastern Florida, near where I went to school at the University of South Florida. Go Bulls. So just a little fun fact at the end. I know that this has been a long lecture because I had to say it all. But please, please, please get this information. This is important so that we can keep moving on to the Civil War. We have about 2.5 months left of school. So definitely, if there are any areas of these lecture notes that you did not understand or you were confused about, please put a star beside them. I'll be happy to explain them. I am posting these on Thursday night, 2/4, so February 4th. So just be ready. By next week, we are going to start moving into the Age of Jackson. So you need to have taken these notes and know these notes by the time we start class, because it will be kind of pointless for you to even be in class if you don't know this information. So it's about a 25-minute lecture. I have faith in you that you'll be able to get through this. If you have any questions, let me know. I'll be happy to help out any way that I can. So I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did, and I hope you enjoyed the memes because my meme game is on point this year. Y'all have a great night.